I Like Me Better by LeilahMoon, Chapter 12. We've made it to second year. Thank you everyone for listening. Hermione sat at a long Gryffindor table, glancing anxiously around the room. Her mind was racing so quickly that she had missed the entirety of the sorting, as well as Dumbledore's speech. Now that the magnificent start of term feast was laid out before her, she found that her stomach was churning too much to eat anything. It had felt like an incredibly long summer, and by August Hermione was counting down the days before she arrived back at Hogwarts. The weeks had dragged, leaving her feeling particularly lonely. Draco had asked Hermione not to write during the holidays because of his parents, and whilst Harry and Ron tried, they were never very forthcoming in their letters. So when she had searched the Hogwarts Express for her two fellow Gryffindors and not found them anywhere, her excitement turned swiftly to panic. And now, for them to not even be in the Great Hall, Hermione didn't know what to think. She glanced towards Draco, who was already watching her. Motioning with his eyes, he looked from Hermione to the doors and back again questioningly. She nodded, packed up her satchel, and left the hall. Moments later, Draco joined her in a nearby alcove. "Are you okay?" he asked. Draco had never seen Hermione look so preoccupied. She had been sat upright and stiff at the table, eyes darting around the room as though she expected to be attacked at any moment. He was concerned something awful must have happened to her on the train, and couldn't resist calling her out to see him. He'd think of an excuse for his housemates later. "Hermione?" "Oh, sorry, Draco," she said absently. "I've just been wondering where Harry and Ron are." His jaw clenched, and a flare of jealousy burnt through him. Biting the inside of his cheek, he replied, "You've not heard the rumours, then?" She looked sharply towards him. "What rumours?" "That Dumb and Dumber flew a car here, crashed it, and have now been expelled." Choosing not to query his muggle reference, Hermione snorted. "Don't be ridiculous, they wouldn't do that." Draco wished it were true, but he just shrugged. "I'm sure they're fine, Granger." Noting the use of her surname, Hermione attempted to turn the conversation in a different direction, but they were both too caught up in their own thoughts for it to be entirely comfortable. Eventually, they agreed to meet in the library as soon as possible. The feast had long ended, and Hermione traipsed up the staircase by herself. As she rounded the corner, a splash of red caught her attention, and she dashed towards it. Ron and Harry stood in front of the fat lady. "There you are! Where have you been? The most ridiculous rumours. Someone said you'd been expelled for crashing a flying car." "Well, we haven't been expelled," Harry assured her. "You're not telling me you did fly here?" said Hermione, sounding almost as severe as Professor McGonagall. "Skip the lecture," said Ron impatiently, "and tell us the new password." "It's Wettlebird," she huffed, "but that's not the point." Her words were cut short, however, as the portrait swung open and there was a sudden storm of clapping. It looked as though the whole Gryffindor house was still awake, packed into a circular room, standing under lopsided tables and squashy armchairs, waiting for them to arrive. Hermione rolled her eyes as the boys were pulled through and she was left to scramble in after them. It was incredibly frustrating to witness the hero treatment Harry and Ron received after she had spent so many hours deeply anxious and worried for their safety. Deciding she would rather be alone in her dormitory, Hermione slunk to the wall and made her way upstairs. The next day didn't start particularly well for Harry and Ron, so Hermione decided to forgive them more readily than she would have usually. It wasn't even 8 in the morning when Ron received an awful howler from his mother. She supposed they had been punished enough. As it happened, Hermione turned out to be incorrect. Apparently, the day was in a merciless mood. Sitting outside during their lunch break, Hermione was lost in her book, Voyages with Vampires, when she noticed a sweet-looking first-year shuffle over to them. "All right, Harry, I'm calling Creevy," he said breathlessly, taking a tentative step forward. "I'm a Gryffindor too. Do you think, would it be all right if... Can I have a picture?" he said, raising his camera hopefully. "A picture?" Harry repeated blankly. Hermione chuckled quietly to herself. Her messy-haired friend had never liked to be the centre of attention. She was wondering how he was going to deal with the situation and whether she could stir the pot by kindly suggesting Colin attend Harry's weekly fan club meeting. There was no time to do anything, however, because when Hermione looked up again, there was Draco, eyes twinkling with mischief, standing behind Colin. "Signed photos? You're giving out signed photos, Potter?" Loud and scathing, Draco's voice echoed around the courtyard. Initially, he had hoped to simply garner Hermione's attention, but now he was rather enjoying himself. "Everyone queue up!" he shouted out to the crowd. "Harry Potter is giving out signed photos." "No, I'm not," said Harry angrily, his fist clenching. "Shut up, Malfoy!" Hermione cringed inwardly when Colin attempted to stand up for Harry by saying, "You're just jealous." Draco caught Hermione's eye a number of times, whilst he continued verbally sparring with Harry, joined by Ron, and she couldn't help but suppress a few smiles. She would have a word with him about his tendency to become a bit too personal at times, but at least he was more imaginative than Ron. "Eat slugs, Malfoy." "Really?" When Gilderoy Lockhart strolled over to the group, Hermione's heart leapt, and she could no longer concentrate on the exchange. She quickly pushed her hard-doodled notes into her bag as Draco caught sight of them, raising his eyebrows. Hermione blushed and fled to the classroom in which she would face the professor again. Chapter 13. The next morning, Hermione was in a foul mood. She had initially become frustrated during Defense Against the Dark Arts the previous day, when no one seemed to be giving Professor Lockhart a fair chance. He had just wanted to give her some hands-on experience. Then Draco had all but ignored her in the library that evening without telling her why, and now Ron was insisting she accompany him to watch Harry's Quidditch practice. The sun had barely risen, yet here she was, freezing to death in the stands, and Harry hadn't even begun playing. Eventually, even Ron was shifting frustratedly in his seat. "Do you think we missed them?" he asked Hermione. She was about to respond when they noticed the team leaving their changing room, still in gear. "Aren't you finished yet?" Ron called incredulously. "Haven't even started," said Harry. "Wood's been teaching us new moves." Hermione sighed irritably and muttered to Ron as the Gryffindors mounted their brooms. "At least there is something to watch now." Ron nodded, his eyes already glued to the game. It wasn't long before Hermione caught a glimpse of green out of the corner of her eye. She leaned over the stands to see the Slytherin team walking onto the pitch. As the red-clad player began to dismount their brooms, Hermione nudged Ron and indicated they ought to head down to see what was going on. "You've got a new seeker," Hermione overheard Wood say distractedly. "Who?" From behind the 6 large figures she saw a small white-haired boy she was very well acquainted with. It was Draco Malfoy. "Aren't you Lucius Malfoy's son?" said Fred, looking at Draco with dislike.
"Funny you should mention Draco's father," said Flint, the team captain. "Let me show you the generous gift he's made to the Slytherin team."
All 7 of them held out their broomsticks. Hermione had no idea what a nimbus was, or whether 2001 was a good model, but she could immediately sense the jealousy and indignation radiating from her house. Ron was even gaping open-mouthed at the sight before him. "Good, aren't they?" said Draco smoothly. "But perhaps Gryffindor team will be able to raise some gold and get new brooms too. You could raffle off those clean sweep 5s. I expect a museum would bid for them." The Slytherins howled with laughter, and something in Hermione snapped. There were numerous reasons why this might have happened. The small things that build up over time often have a wry way of escaping at the worst moments. But she knew that, ultimately, this was no excuse for what she said next. At least no one on the Gryffindor team had to buy their way in. They got in on pure talent. She immediately regretted her words. Draco's smug look flickered, and she noticed pain flash through his eyes. Hermione tried to convey her remorse with her own expression, but it wasn't enough. Draco's face became suddenly blank, and he looked at her coldly. "No one asked you your opinion, you filthy little mudblood," he spat. Hermione couldn't move. She felt frozen to the spot. Shock was written over both her and Draco's faces. Whilst they stood staring at one another, there was an instant uproar around them. Flint had to dive in front of Draco to stop Fred and George jumping on him. Alicia shrieked, "How dare you!" and Ron plunged his hand into his robes, pulled out his wand, yelling, "You'll pay for that one, Malfoy!" and pointed it furiously under Flint's arm at Draco's face. Hermione wasn't sure what happened next, but she suddenly realized that Ron was being violently sick. Grabbing Harry, she pulled him away from the brawl, and together they heaved their friend over to Hagrid's house. Hermione did not look back. A few days later, Hermione, still refusing to give 1 second's thought to Draco Malfoy, was stamping her feet as they left nearly headless Nick's death day party, hoping to get some feeling back into her frozen toes. When Harry suddenly stumbled to a halt. He was clutching at the stone wall, looking around and squinting up and down the dimly lit passageway. "Harry, what are you—" "It's that voice again. Shut up a minute." Hermione exchanged a worried look with Ron as Harry said again, "Listen!" Abruptly, Harry took off running up the stairs and into the entrance hall. There he stood, stock still for a moment before yelling, "It's going to kill someone!" She was thoroughly confused and also highly concerned at this point, but could see no alternative to chasing Harry through the corridor and up numerous flights of stairs. Ron had a similar idea, and they followed him, panting as they went, not stopping until they turned a corner into a deserted passageway. "Harry, what was that all about?" Ron said, wiping sweat off his face. "I couldn't hear anything." But Hermione gave a sudden gasp, pointing down the corridor. "Look!" Something was shining on the wall ahead. They approached slowly, squinting through the darkness. Foot-high words had been daubed on the wall between two windows, shimmering in the light cast by flaming torches. "The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air, beware." "What's that thing hanging underneath?" said Ron, a slight quiver in his voice. As they edged nearer, Harry almost slipped over. There was a large puddle of water on the floor. Hermione grabbed him, and they inched towards the message, eyes fixed on the dark shadow beneath it. Mrs. Norris, the caretaker's cat, was hanging by her tail from the torch bracket. She was stiff as a board and staring. Hermione gasped and took a step backwards. It wasn't long before a crowd was headed in their direction, crashing into the passage from both ends, presumably having just finished their Halloween feast. A deafening silence fell as the students began to notice the grisly sight. Finally, although in reality it couldn't have been more than a few minutes, Dumbledore arrived on the scene, followed by a number of other teachers. After a brief discussion, the 3 Gryffindors were swept into Lockhart's office to explain themselves. Professor Dumbledore could say some peculiar things at times, but Hermione was pleased that the Trial's innocence was never called into question when discussing the unfortunate event with Mrs. Norris. However, since then, she had struggled to research anything useful about the Chamber of Secrets. Finally, feeling slightly less frustrated, Hermione strode from her History of Magic class one afternoon, pleased that she had gathered some information from Professor Binns when she was dragged into an empty classroom by the back of her robes. "For Godric's sake, let me go!" she cried. "It's just me," a familiar voice said. "What do you want, Malfoy?" "I wanted to make sure that you were okay." "You wanted to make sure I was okay?" She paused. "After which incident exactly?" Draco didn't respond for a moment. "The message on the wall, the Chamber of Secrets and everything." "Like you care!" Hermione responded vehemently. "The last I heard, I was only a filthy little mudblood to you." The sound of that word caused Draco to shudder. It used to be a normal part of his vocabulary, and now it made him feel sick. To think he had even considered, let alone used the slur, filled him with shame. Unfortunately, in this moment, his shame was expressed as anger. "Oh, right," Draco retorted. "Like you were such an angel. The things you said to me." She snorted. "I know you saw how much I regretted it as soon as it left my mouth, and yet you saw it fit to throw mudblood in my face as if it were a joke to you. I really hoped you had changed, Draco." I have. How can you say that you regretted what you said immediately, and yet I'm not allowed the same courtesy?" Hermione briefly considered his words. Did he have a point? Ultimately, she was still too angry to accept anything other than her point of view. "Because I would never use such a derogatory word against someone who was supposed to be my best friend, even if they had said something hurtful to me beforehand. Honestly, Malfoy, at this point I wouldn't be surprised if you were there of Slytherin, hoping to get rid of me and all the other mudbloods." Draco gaped at her. "How dare you say that to me? Do you even know me at all?" "No, I don't think so," she said, turning to leave. Burying his pride, Draco reached out to grab her hand. "Please, Hermione, just one last thing." "What?" "What precautions have you," he swallowed, "Potter and Weasley put into place to keep you safe?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "Come on! Enemies of the air, beware! Whoever it is, they're after Muggleborns. You have to be on alert." Hermione was absolutely not going to give him the pleasure of admitting she had already been concerned about this, or acknowledgement that neither Harry nor Ron had considered her the way Draco had. "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself, so if that's all you had to say, I'm leaving," she said, storming from the room. To be continued. Thank you for listening to today's chapters of I Like Me Better by LeilahMoon, read by LMX Mabella. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, AO3, Instagram, or Tumblr.